You're listening to the Minutes on Growth podcast, the show that brings you mindfully curated insights into relationships, spirituality, personal development, and everything in between, with your host, Tannaz Hosseinpour.
Hi, soul friends. It's Tannaz Hosseinpour, and welcome back to another short solo episode of the Minutes on Growth podcast. I recently created a series of reels on Instagram on the importance of fighting fair when navigating conflict, and that resulted in many DMs asking me to dive deeper into what fighting fair actually looks like. So here we are. To begin, I really want to start by saying that the presence of conflict is never an issue. In fact, when couples tell me that they never fight, it's rarely a good sign. It means that perhaps someone has been abandoning their needs and not speaking their truth, because disagreements are normal. Seeing the world differently is normal. I mean, siblings in the same household have differences, let alone two individuals coming together with two completely different families of origin, two completely different sets of experiences and worldviews. So conflict is never the issue. The presence of conflict is never the issue. But how we fight and ultimately how we repair is what matters. So the goal is to fight fair. But what does fighting fair look like? Well, when we're talking about conflict resolution, respect needs to be present. And we show respect by making sure that we avoid name calling or attacking our partner's character. This is what happens when we shift gears into criticism, one of the 4 horsemen outlined by Dr. John Gottman. For example, the problem shifts from the unwashed dishes that were pissing you off to now your partner being labeled as messy and inconsiderate. So when we are attacking our partner's character, naturally, the other partner is going to get defensive and we're going to lose sight of the problem that we were discussing. So we want to avoid attacking our partner's character. We want to avoid calling them names because, again, that will lead to them getting defensive. And when they get defensive, they might criticize you back, they might shut down. So it won't allow us to navigate through the process of repair or resolution. We also want to avoid bringing up the past. This can sidetrack us from the issue at hand. So I always remind my clients to tackle one issue at a time. If we start talking about the dishes and then we go into, but even yesterday you didn't do X, Y, and Z, the other partner doesn't know which one to tackle. So then you get stuck into this loop of bringing all these things from the past into the mix of the present moment. And by the end of the convo, rarely anything gets resolved. So now we have a messier pot to navigate next time. So if we tackle one issue at a time, we're able to process it better and move forward with a little bit more ease and grace. It's also important to avoid overgeneralizing terms like always and never. For example, you never show up on time, or you always take the other person's side. In that moment, when the other person hears the word never or always, instead of them being able to recognize the meaning behind your complaint, they will focus on the times that they did show up or that they did take your side. So the mind will find evidence of that statement not being true. And this will lead them into defensiveness, which is one of the 4 horsemen as outlined by Dr. John Gottman. When we're fighting fair, it's also important to not make assumptions about the other person's intentions. When we make an assumption, there is a high risk of projection taking place. So we're projecting past experiences, past trauma onto the situation at hand, and it might not be a true reflection of that incident. So you didn't answer the phone on purpose to punish me for a morning argument, or you were late because you don't respect my time. It is easy for our inner critic to make these deductions. And that's why it's important that we do two things. One is to practice curiosity, and the other is to give the person the benefit of the doubt. So practicing curiosity allows us to ask questions instead of making assumptions. So, hey, can you let me know why you didn't answer the phone or why you were late to our date? Curiosity brings clarity. It creates space for the other person to share their side of the story. Whereas assumptions create ruptures. Because when we make an assumption, there's two scenarios. One, we vocalize it and the other person gets defensive. No, that's not what it was. And, when they get defensive, they might go into victim mindset. They might criticize you back. Or we don't vocalize it and we just kind of keep it internally. And our behavior towards the other person shifts, which then can create a domino effect. So we want to avoid, these terms always and never as well. When we're practicing curiosity and the other person is sharing their experience with us and the feelings they felt, it's important that we don't dismiss or minimize their feelings. Everyone's feelings are valid for them. My feelings are valid, your feelings are valid, and both of our feelings being valid doesn't invalidate the other person's feelings. It might not be how you feel or how you would have felt in their shoes, but that doesn't mean that they can't feel that way. So it's important that we refrain from making comments such as, you're being too sensitive, or you're wrong for feeling that way. Because again, the other person might get defensive, or they might shut down, or they might no longer feel safe to express their feelings. And so they're no longer showing up authentically in that dynamic. Another element of fighting fair is the tone we use. We want to make sure we're not speaking in a condescending tone, we're not shouting, we're not screaming, and we're actually allowing the other person to speak without us interrupting them with our counter arguments. I call this lawyering up in my sessions. Sometimes I notice that instead of the client listening to what their partner is saying so that they can better understand them, they're coming up with their responses in their head so they can quote unquote win the argument. But guess what? We're not in court and you're both on the same team. It's always us versus the problem. It's never me versus you. And this perspective shift can help us be more present and actually hear what the other person is saying. And on the topic of tone, language matters too. So we want to avoid belittling language, such as didn't you learn better from your parents, or were you raised in a barn? When we use sarcasm and we start to belittle our partner, we're entering into the realm of contempt, which is technically speaking criticism on steroids. And research conducted by the Gottman Institute shows that the presence of contempt was the number one predictor of divorce. So when we're talking about contempt, we're talking about nonverbal and verbal. So verbal is belittling, I am holier than thou mindset, sarcasm, and nonverbal is rolling our eyes, smirking. So we want to be familiar with what contempt looks like so that we can stop ourselves from engaging in it and to be more mindful of how it shows up and when it shows up. And speaking of divorce, another element of fighting fair is not threatening to leave the relationship every other day. So if we threaten to end the relationship during every conflict, this ruptures the relational safety present. The other person will no longer feel safe in that relationship. It doesn't feel stable. It's like they're walking on eggshells. They don't know when the next shoe is going to drop and you're going to walk out, which then can lead to other issues. And lastly, when we're talking about fighting fair, we're also talking about the process of repairing. And in order to repair, we really need to be able to take accountability for the impact of our actions. And I know that sometimes in a fight, you're thinking to yourself, no, my intention wasn't that. My intention wasn't to hurt you. And yes, intention matters, but on the other side of the scale of intention is impact. So even though your intention wasn't to hurt the other person, the truth of the matter is the other person feels hurt. So we need to take accountability for the impact of our actions. And I actually created a reel on Instagram where I outlined 10 examples of taking accountability and giving you just examples of what it would sound like so you can get more familiar with that. So I want you to remember, please, that the presence of conflict is not a red flag. But how we fight can be one. So it's super important, especially since the majority of us didn't learn this in school, and maybe for many, healthy relationships wasn't modeled to them as a child. And maybe they were raised in households where conflict was not embraced, and your parents weren't able to navigate conflict with ease and grace, and they weren't able to grow from conflict. And every time there was a disagreement, it would lead to a full-blown out fight. So now there's trauma around the idea of conflict. So it's super important for us to educate ourselves and to remind ourselves of these elements that create the skill of fighting fair, so that we can learn it, we can master it, and through this process, we're allowing ourselves to grow and evolve, both as individuals and as a dynamic. So whether it's a romantic relationship, so with a couple, or even in friendship. I hope this episode has served you and has given you the insights to handle conflict better. Thank you for listening. Speak soon.
Thank you for joining us this week on Minutes on Growth. If you enjoyed today's episode, then make sure you never miss a show by clicking the subscribe button now.